In the autumn of 1954, France found itself gripped by a strange and unnerving spectacle. From quiet rural villages to bustling towns and cities, witnesses reported everything from flying discs, cigars and carrots, to little creatures in diving gear waddling beneath a glowing sphere. Newspapers buzzed with excitement as sightings unfolded night after night, spreading across the country like a raging epidemic. It was the first major group of UFO sightings outside of America, and by the end of the year, more than 2,000 reports were made from people from all regions of the country and all walks of life. Was this signs of an impending alien invasion, or all the outcome of a collective delusion? That was the question that was posed at the time, and it's still one that's never really been answered. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 9, Episode 19. I'm your host Ben, as always. It's good to be back. I thought I'd do something a little bit more quirky this week. I was, some reason this time of year, I always kind of start looking into sort of the quirkier side of things. And I guess it's just the impending Christmas. I don't know. Figured, we'd do something a little bit quirky. And we're back in France again, which is, I think, for the fourth time this season that we're back in France. So, I hope you enjoy it. Before we start, just a quick shout out again. If you are interested in taking part in the Christmas campfire episode this year, do send your stories in as soon as you can, really. Well, not that much of a rush. Anytime between now and sort of 20th of December-ish. That would be great. I've had already a good sort of like dozen or so entries, so it's looking like it's going to be another great year. So if you'd like to take part, do send your story in whenever you can, sort of between now and, say, about the 20th of December. So thanks very much for that. Let's get going. This is Flying Carrots and Little Divers, the French UFO wave of 1954. Undeniably, the first well-known sighting of an unidentified flying object, or in modern parlance, unidentified aerial phenomena, is the report from the pilot Kenneth Arnold, who described a series of objects in the sky that he had seen whilst flying through the state of Washington in America in 1947. Shortly after he made the sighting, he described the objects to the press as discs with a saucer-like appearance, leading to headline writers coining the term flying saucer, which would dominate sightings for several decades after. Fear of visitors from outer space was not an especially new concept at the time. The Aurora sightings from America in 1897 are just one example of an early alien panic, and the mysterious airships of the early 20th century had more than a few journalists considering the possibility of an alien invasion. In science fiction, writers have been conjuring stories of humans visiting civilizations on the moon since at least the 2nd century, and in more modern terms, Camille Flammarion wrote of abstract alien beings as early as 1864. More famously, H.G. Wells published his infamous work, The War of the Worlds, first as a serialization in 1897 and then as a full novel in 1898 that reached a huge audience. Back in reality, the term Foo Fighters was coined during the Second World War, as pilots reported unexplained lights in the sky over both the European and Pacific theatres. And shortly after, the Roswell crash incident sparked an interest which has only ever grown until today, where it stands with an almost mythic status. By the 1950s, the Cold War was well underway, and science fiction was perfectly primed to capitalise on the paranoia and fear that bubbled just beneath the surface as the nuclear arms race gathered momentum. In America, sightings of unexplained aerial phenomena began to gather steam, culminating in the Washington UFO flap of 1952, where a series of sightings of unexplainable objects were made across 2 weekends in July. That year, there were more than 700 reports of things seen in the sky, more than 5-fold the reports from the years previous. Meanwhile, in Europe, things were comparatively quiet. The United Kingdom had seen a few isolated incidents in 1950 and 1952, but nothing that could compare to the Washington flap of the same year. That was, at least until 1954, when all of a sudden, it seemed as if the extraterrestrial tourists had discovered a whole new continent, and like a viral takeaway on TikTok, the crowds descended. The evening of the 4th of January 1954 was a typically cold, midwinter's day across France. In the south of France, just north from Marseille, the Marignane airport was quiet under a dark, moonless night that felt bitter with a harsh wind whipping across the open runways and between the metallic hangars. Around 9 p.m, a fireman was on watch over one of the hangars when he saw, arriving from the south, a round luminous craft, which seemed to be descending at rapid pace upon one of the airport's runways. The aircraft struck the tarmac and rebounded several times before appearing to come to a stop. Now, this may not have been an unusual sight in many airports, but in Marignane, planes did not land at night, at least not usually. The fireman paced to the hangar, picked up the telephone and called Tower Control, who sent out a welcome party just in case a private plane had been forced into a landing in an emergency. When they arrived on the runway, however, they found nothing. There were no lights, no people, and there were certainly no planes. The airport police were drafted to look around, just in case a rogue weather balloon had fallen somewhere on the runway, but nothing was found all night. The next morning, a new patrol was sent to the airstrip, and this time, a few pieces of small metallic debris were recovered, the largest of which was a 15-centimetre metal rod with a pin-like head on the end. Otherwise, though, there was no sign of anything, and nobody else seemed to have seen the object come, or, more importantly, leave the airport. Naturally, the local press jumped on the story, and though tempered at first, the articles soon escalated from suggesting the possibilities of flying saucers as a light-hearted ending to the story to full-blown headlines claiming that ghost saucers were landing in the south of France. Printed several times for almost a week in half a dozen papers, the story never really took off, and by February it was almost entirely forgotten. Whatever the fireman had seen, it had almost certainly been unusual. As winter turned into spring and spring to summer, however, it continued to grow less and less so, as similar stories crept out from around the country that appeared to describe similar unexplainable phenomena. By the end of the summer, the story would be altogether pedestrian, as lights in the sky and small pieces of metal were overshadowed by hundreds of reports of experiences that were significantly more difficult to explain. Though, of course, the press was certainly happy to try. It was the morning of August 12, 1954, in the town of Dole, 200 miles southeast of Paris, and Mr. and Mrs. Pardon were sleeping in their apartment overlooking the fields and canals that epitomise an area frequently cited as one of the most beautiful in all of France. The clock had just ticked past 7:15, and the sun was just rising, when suddenly Mr. Pardon was startled awake by an intense light that had reflected from the window pane. Figuring it was too bright to be the morning sun, he slipped out of bed, strolled over to the window, and looked out into the hue of the early morning light. In the sky, under the haze of a thin veil of cloud, he saw what appeared to be a gigantic disk moving across the sky from left to right. Rubbing his eyes, he stepped back towards the bed, silently shook his wife awake, and dragged her over to the window, where the pair watched the huge object that had, by now, begun to emit a soft blue light. As it moved across the sky, the light changed from blue to white, and then, perhaps most bizarrely, became encircled by a bright red halo. Rotating, the disc stretched and slimmed into a cigar shape as it shifted on its axis, and then, with a faint buzzing sound that broke the otherwise silent vista, the Pardons watched it for 10 minutes as it moved off into the distance, disappearing over the rooftops and out of sight. The Pardons' story made it to a regional paper a couple of days later, when a small 2-column piece was published on the sighting. But otherwise, despite the fairly dramatic description, very little fuss was made over the unusual event, and it was quickly forgotten, at least for a week or so, until another summer sighting caused quite a stir far across the country. Just before 1 a.m, on the morning of Monday the 23rd of August, 1954, the 24-year-old son of a local merchant, Bernard Miseret, was returning home to his house in Vernon, a small town in France with a population of around 14,000 people that's perched on the northern bank of the River Seine. He parked his car up in the garage and shuffled out of the large door and into the front garden, where he looked up into the night sky. It was a clear night, a week before the next full moon, and the glowing white satellite was not especially bright in the rich blackness of the summer night sky. Unusually, however, the moon was not the only light that Bernard could see. Just on the north bank of the river, he could make out a pale white light that otherwise should never have been there. It was about 300 yards from his home, and squinting into the dark, as his eyes became adjusted, he began tracing the outline of what he described as a huge, silent, motionless, luminous mass that appeared to be hanging in the sky. I'd been watching this amazing spectacle for a couple of minutes, when suddenly from the bottom of the cigar came an object like a horizontal disc, which dropped at first in free fall, then slowed and suddenly swayed and dived horizontally across the river towards me, becoming very luminous. For a very short time, I could see the disc full face. It was surrounded by a halo of brilliant light. A few minutes after it had disappeared behind me, going southwest at prodigious speed, a similar object came from the cigar and went through the same manoeuvres. A third object came, then a fourth. There was then a longer interval, and finally a fifth disc detached itself from the cigar, which was still motionless. This last disc dropped much lower than the earlier ones, to the level of the new bridge, where it remained still for an instant, swaying slightly. At that time, I could see very clearly its circular form and its red luminosity, more intense at the centre and fading out at the edges, and the glowing halo that surrounded it. After a few seconds' pause, it wobbled like the first four and took off like a flash towards the north, where it was lost in the distance as it gained altitude. During this time, the luminosity of the cigar had faded, and the gigantic object, which may have been 300 feet long, had sunk into darkness. The spectacle had lasted about 3/4 of an hour. The next morning, unable to shake the strange sight that had unsettled him enough to have kept him up for most of the night, Bernard reported the incident to the local police, who, far from acting shocked, told him that he'd not been the only person to have seen the weird object. In fact, 2 other policemen, along with a chemical engineer working with the military, out driving on a road nearby Bernard's house, had reported exactly the same thing. It wasn't long before the press were picking up on the story, and within 24 hours, newspapers, both local and national, were writing up headlines for Bernard's mysterious cigar. For the most part, they were small pieces, a paragraph or 2, that gave a few vague details and called it a day. 1 or 2 did attempt to explain the mystery away, with the consensus seeming to be that Bernard had simply witnessed the headlights of cars forming on a celestial screen that had been made up of several layers of air of differing densities. Whatever it was, it had made a real impression for a few days, as papers scuffled to tell the story. One even photographed Bernard as he was pointing to the sky behind him, vaguely pinpointing where the object had been. Perhaps understandably, a flurry of UFO sightings were made across France in the week that followed the Vernon sighting. It wasn't just the excitement stirred up by the press articles, and people were really seeing things in the skies. The things they were seeing, however, were all part of a perfectly explainable astronomical event. While several reports were made with somewhat unexplainable phenomena, the vast majority were of a meteor shower that had been visible across France in the final week of August. Over 40 sightings were reported, and all were quickly discounted, all the way from Maine-et-Loire in the west to Lyon in the east. This flurry of sightings culminated on the evening of the 30th of August, when a meteor was seen in the skies just after 8 p.m, leading to over 20 reports, almost all of which would have been tightly wound by the recent press stories. Quite unlike the previous sightings, the meteor was, all told, fairly uninspiring. Far from a carrot or cigar, most every report described a ball of light with a short tail, travelling very fast and appearing to fall through the sky. It was all looking to be a somewhat anticlimactic end to the hectic summer months of sightings that had been leaking out across the country. And then, the very next day, just as the news of the meteor was spreading, a group of 6 people saw something completely different. Just outside of Dijon, the Dijon-Longvic Air Base, owned by the French Air Force, had recently been born again from the ashes, following the German occupation during the Second World War, when it had been requisitioned by the Nazis, who repurposed it as a prisoner of war camp. The airbase then fell to ruins thanks to German and American bombing throughout the rest of the war. By the early 1950s, it had been rebuilt as an airfield and was housing the French Air Force's first jet planes, which was precisely what a group of 6 people had been watching, just after lunchtime on the 31st of August. As the jet planes went about their standard manoeuvres, the onlookers noted an unusual red light in the sky, flying much higher than any of the French planes. Travelling from east to west at a rapid speed, its colour blinked from red to orange to silver before disappearing over the horizon. 2 days later, a local paper published a small article on the sighting, asking a question that many were now asking all across the country. We were told it could not have been a balloon launched by one of the planes, given the object's high speed, it said, leaving the open conclusion, was it a flying saucer? Whatever it was, it made little fuss, and the flurry of August sightings ended in something of a confused buzz, as people mulled over the possibilities. Flying cigars, saucers, or all just meteors. It had been a strange month, but in truth, things were just getting started in the skies over France. The Vernon cigar UFO had been all but forgotten when reports came in a few weeks later of another similar sighting. Vendée, a coastal department 250 miles southwest of Paris, full of scenic beaches and medieval castles, was shaken when hundreds of witnesses, this time in broad daylight, had their own strange sightings. It was just before 5 p.m. on the afternoon of Tuesday the 14th of September when Georges Fortin, a 34-year-old farmer in the village of La Gabalière, looked up into the sky and noticed what he described as a blue-violet mist in the shape of a cigar or a carrot, which rose up into the sky from a long layer of storm clouds. This luminous cloud appeared rigid. Whenever it moved, and its movements had no connection with the movements of the clouds themselves, it did so all of a piece, as if it were actually some gigantic machine surrounded by mists. It came down rather fast from the ceiling of clouds to an altitude which we thought was perhaps half a mile above us. Then it stopped, and the point rose quickly until the object was in a vertical position, where it became motionless. After watching this sight for several minutes, the farmer spotted what looked like a vapour trail spinning around the object, extending from a small metallic disc which seemed to be looping round and round the larger object before shooting off into the distance. The whole experience lasted almost 30 minutes. And a mile away, a 67-year-old cabbage farmer and widow working alongside her daughter saw almost the exact same thing. Unsurprisingly, the local newspaper journalists were keen to fetch a story, though sadly, it seems like in their excitement, they pressured many of the witnesses to describe things that they weren't even sure that they'd seen in the first place, including the image of little men on board a saucer. In the end, the skeptics chalked the whole event up to a tornado, though those more keen to believe were spotting similarities between the cigar spotted by Bernard in August and the cigar now seen by the farmers of Vendée. Elsewhere in the country, even stranger reports had been filing into the authorities. A week earlier, 2 men, 27-year-old Emile Renard, a mason, and his helper, 23-year-old Yves, were riding their bicycles to work near Amiens, 12 miles north of Paris. It was around 7:15 in the morning, and the sun had just risen when the tyre on Yves' bicycle gave out and the two stopped to try and pump it back up. Whilst Yves was busy with the hand pump, Emile noticed a haystack around 200 yards away on the brow of a hill in the field that they were riding alongside. At first, Emile thought it had looked a bit odd, and he drew Yves' attention to it just as he realised that it didn't actually appear to have been standing on the ground at all. Rather, it seemed to be floating just above it. Furthermore, it appeared to be moving back and forth, gently like a slow-moving pendulum. Curious for a closer look, both men hopped the fence and made their way towards the object. When it gathered pace, moving upwards on a diagonal slant for about 50 feet before it shot straight up into the sky, silently moving up and into the clouds, where they lost sight of it altogether. Both men described it in similar ways, something like an upturned dish, and Emile said he thought he saw a wide door-type plate on one side. The 2 men reported the sighting to a local policeman who suggested that they escalate it to the police station in a nearby town. The police diligently took both their statements and then travelled out to the field, but they found no sign of any flying haystack. At first, the whole thing was chalked up to a hoax. The same conclusion arrived by the military, who also looked into the case. But when the story did finally hit the papers a month later, much to the upset of the 2 men who wanted nothing to do with the publicity, several people from nearby villages gave statements that corroborated the original story. At first, the story seemed too wild to be true, but as others later pointed out, if an object could be seen flying, then why couldn't it be seen on the ground too? This level of acceptance, though, was duly put to the test just 3 days later, when an even stranger story began filtering out of a rural region of France known as Muriaras, just south from the centre of the country. It was around 8:30 p.m. on the night of 10th of September when 50-year-old farmer Antoine Mazur began packing up after a long day's work and made his way towards his farmhouse. Slinging his tools over his shoulder, he started out on the mile-long trek along the hedge-lined road that took him home. He stopped for a moment to roll himself a cigarette on a little patch of open woodland, where he was suddenly struck dumbfounded by the sight of something stopping him dead in his tracks. I had taken only a few steps when, in the gathering darkness, I found myself face to face with an unknown person dressed in a very peculiar fashion. This person was of average height and was wearing a sort of helmet without any ear flaps, something like the ones motorcyclists wear. I didn't know what to do. After a moment of confusion, when I wondered who and what this was, I thought he must be a crazy man in disguise. As he continued to advance slowly towards me, making peculiar gestures and low bows, I decided that he had no intention of attacking me. He was right in front of me. Then, still holding my pitchfork in my right hand, I rather hesitantly held out my left hand to him. He seized it eagerly and shook it very hard. Then he suddenly pulled me tight up to him, drawing my head against his helmet. I really saw stars. All this had happened in complete silence. Recovering from my astonishment, I ventured to say good evening. He made no reply, passed in front of me and went a few yards away, into the dense shadow of the woods. It seemed to me that he had got down on his knees. A few seconds later I heard a low hum, like a bee buzzing, and I saw rising amongst the branches towards the sky, almost vertically, a kind of dark object, which seemed to me to have the shape of a cigar swollen out on one side, about 15 or 20 feet long. It passed under the high-tension wires and disappeared into the sky toward the west, in the direction of Limoges. After standing stupefied for a moment, Antoine's head cleared, and he rushed up to where he had seen the shape shoot up into the sky, but found nothing. When he returned home 20 minutes later, his wife thought that he looked unwell, so pale he was. With some awkwardness, he retold his story, pleading with her to keep it to herself and to tell no one. A story like Antoine's was not one to keep to yourself, however, and after she told a neighbour, who then told a friend, the story wound up both reported to the police and to the press. The police did visit the area as part of an investigation, but they found no trace of any spacecraft, nor of any spacemen. Within days, the story, quite unsurprisingly, had shot through France in dozens of newspapers, all of which seemed to take the story quite lightly, with headlines like, "I kissed a helmeted Martian who was coming down from a flying cigar." Things did become a little more serious when, several days later, a handful of witnesses from a neighbouring village came forward to say that they had seen an object, red in colour and shaped like a cigar, move up into the sky, roughly in the direction that Antoine's encounter had been. It was also noted in several papers that Antoine himself was well known in the area and not one for tall tales. Indeed, some went quite far, saying that the man had absolutely no imagination at all. As it turned out, on the exact same night, another encounter was happening that would eclipse even Antoine's strange experience. Marius de Wilder was a 34-year-old metalworker living with his family in the town of Blanc-Miseran, perched on the Belgian border. Their rural house sat just outside a small village and was surrounded by woods and fields, more or less isolated, if not for a railway track that ran down one side of the fenced garden, that humped coal back to civilization from the nearby mines. It was around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the 10th of September, just 2 hours after Antoine's strange encounter halfway across the country, when he was pulled from the book that he had been reading in the kitchen by the sound of his dog Kiki barking. Having already seen his wife and child to bed earlier that evening, Marius made his way quietly outside to see what the animal was so upset about, grabbing a flashlight on the way. When I got to the garden, I noticed on the railway track, less than 6 yards from my door, on the left, a sort of dark mass. Some farmer left his cart there, I thought at first. I have to tell all the station men first thing in the morning to take it away, or we'll have an accident. Just then, my dog came up to me, crawling on her belly, and all at once I heard furious footsteps on my right. There is a path there that we call the smuggler's path, for they sometimes use it at night. Kiki turned towards the sound and started barking again. I turned on my flashlight and directed its beam towards the path, and what I saw had nothing to do with smugglers. Two creatures, such as I had never seen before, were not more than 3 or 4 yards away from me, right behind the fence, the only thing that separated us, walking along one behind the other towards the dark mass that I had noticed on the track. The one in front turned around towards me. The beam of my light caught a reflection from glass or metal where his face should have been. I had the distinct impression that his head was enclosed in a diver's helmet. In fact, both creatures were dressed in one-piece outfits, like the suits that divers wear. They were very short, probably less than 3.5 feet tall, but very wide in the shoulders, and the helmets protecting their heads looked enormous. I could see their legs, small in proportion to their height, it seemed to me, but on the other hand, I couldn't see any arms. I don't know whether they had any. Hesitating only for a moment, Marius dashed forward, rounding up his garden fence, hoping to flank the intruders and accost them. But when he reached almost within touching distance, a bright light, which he described to be like a magnesium flare, burst in front of him from whatever was sitting on the railway tracks. Completely paralysed, Marius tried to let out a yell towards the figures, but just as his legs would no longer move, nor could he make any sound with his voice. All that he could make out was the sound of footsteps as the two intruders made their way towards the railway tracks. Finally, the light subsided and the garden fell into darkness. At the same time, the feeling returned to Marius's legs, and the man stumbled forward, but only in time to see the object lift up from the tracks and fly off straight up into the sky and out of sight. Just like Antoine, Marius stood stupefied for a moment before heading back into his house, where he woke his wife, told his story, and then the pair made their way to the police station, where he reported the encounter in full. If he had been worried that the police wouldn't take him seriously, he was quickly reassured when the sighting was fully investigated by the police, the Air Police, and the Department of Territorial Security. All three took it very seriously due to the amount of smuggling that went along the border, and all three took his statement before tracking out to the rural farmhouse on Monday the 13th of September with suspicions that someone had been smuggling goods over the border in a helicopter. They quickly dropped this idea, however, when they noted a series of telegraph cables that crisscrossed the area, making a helicopter landing all but impossible. No footprints were found at the scene, but on 5 of the wooden railway sleepers, deep, inch-square indentations had been freshly carved from the rough, thick wood. Later, railroad engineers calculated that the weight required to have made the indentations would have been something in the region of 30 tons, far more than anything a helicopter might have weighed. Naturally, people questioned whether or not the whole thing had been nothing but a hoax, but several quotes were reported in the press, including one from the police chief himself, that appeared to vouch for Marius's reliability. "I have experience of interrogations," the chief said, "and I can vouch that Mr. De Wilder does not invent anything. This is also the opinion gathered by the Air Police Force. You can't make up such a story without betraying yourself, at one time or another." By now, the sheer number of reports in the press from all across France were beginning to add up, and the pile of unexplained reports were not going unnoticed. With the incredible story from Marius, papers as far as Australia were printing pieces on what was now being dubbed the French flying saucer fever. On the 16th of October, the Sydney Morning Herald printed a full-page article on the sightings, though it was far from serious. France, the land of logic, is in the full grip of the fever of flying saucers and of little men in space helmets who make friendly, if unintelligible, advances to startled peasants or nail them to the spot with a hypnotic green ray. 2 weeks later, Time magazine wrote an article on the pandemic sightings too, though they were a little more charitable, chalking the many reports up to a collective hallucination. Whatever it was that was happening, serious or not, it was true that France was squarely in the middle of a flood of reports, and they showed absolutely no signs of stopping with Antoine and Marius's little men. As September crept on, reports continued to flood in on lights seen in the skies of France. Until now, however, they were almost exclusively single reports of single sightings, They were never repeated and never giving their witnesses a second chance to confirm what they'd seen. This all changed in October, however, when a string of sightings began in the small village of Bustling, in the far east of France, just 15 miles from the German border. It was 11 p.m. on the night of Friday the 1st of October, and Mr. Romain and Mr. Renfort were standing on their doorstep when they spotted a bright object in the sky moving in an erratic motion that was described as resembling a dead leaf falling through the air. One moment it would hover in place before rising, falling and moving back and forth at some speed. Both men felt sure that they could hear some kind of engine noise, and they described the light as being elliptical in shape and several meters in diameter. A few moments later, the objects disappeared entirely. All told, this was a rather less spectacular event compared to some of the earlier September sightings and experiences, at least until it returned the next night, where it was seen in the sky for almost 2 hours and reported by dozens of witnesses from 2 separate towns. Beginning at 8 p.m, the object flew back and forth, up and down, as erratic as the night before, with several witnesses watching it for over an hour each, before it disappeared from sight, becoming visible from the next village over. On the next night, on Sunday the 3rd of October, the object was visible in the sky for more than 3 hours, appearing just after 8 p.m, and fittering about until almost 11:45. Numerous descriptions filtered to the press, including an object described as a green luminous disc, which at one point hovered still and then, after sending out a purplish beam, shot off into the darkness at incredible speed. Later in the sighting, the object appeared to hover over a wooded area, and several witnesses, who had been following the light for some time, came to the conclusion that it must have been getting ready to land. Around 11:45 p.m, another group of witnesses tracked this object to a field where it supposedly landed about 30 feet from the road. Several people who had followed its trajectory stood around frozen, their cars parked by the roadside, and they watched the object, too afraid to approach. Described as a motionless disc emitting a soft green light, the onlookers watched the object for several minutes before deciding that they'd seen their fill and then, completely inexplicably, just turning around and going home. The ending of this sighting is almost as unexplainable as the phenomena itself, and it certainly could be seen as anticlimactic, but it was far from the only sighting to take place that night. In fact, it was only one of more than 30 sightings on the 3rd of October. As more reports came to the fore, more witnesses grew emboldened to tell their own stories, until the whole weekend had generated literally hundreds of reports made from right across the country. On Saturday, the 2nd of October, a merchant named Emile Nicolas, who had been out testing a scooter that he had built, saw a blackish mass descend towards the ground. On my left, a very black mass that descended from the sky vertically and landed in a meadow between the Dijon-Bourget railway line and the road about 50 metres from me. I stopped immediately to better observe the craft, which, as soon as it was on the ground, let escape through 2 openings of oval shape, a light, yellowish but very strong. Nothing moved. I stayed watching for at least 10 minutes, the craft, which measured about 8 metres wingspan, whose base was very cylindrical, while the top formed a slight curve. I could not get closer, but I had the idea to get to Mr. Rideau, who was in my workshop. I turned on my engine, and as I put it on at full throttle, the lights went out and the craft rose very quickly vertically. I returned to the place with Mr. Rideau, but we saw nothing. Like many others, Emile kept the sighting to himself until the following day, when a flurry of new reports emboldened him to tell his own story. Much further north, in the region of Somme, 2 18-year-old men, Bernard Devoisin and René Coudet, were riding bicycles at around 6:45 p.m. when they were drawn to a halt after seeing an object sitting in the road 150 yards ahead of them. Emitting a faint orange glow, they pushed their bikes to the side of the road and they watched on in shock. It was circular, 3 yards wide, perhaps 2 yards high, and called to mind the shape of a haystack. Near it, something moved, which we first took for an animal. But as we approached it, we soon saw that it was a creature the height of a child, dressed like a diver. It entered the machine, which took rapidly to the air without a sound when we were no further than 70 yards away from it. As wild as these descriptions sounded, they all seem to tally with many of the witness reports from that weekend and beyond. Some suggested that the reports that weekend were of a helicopter. Others said that it was all just simply a hoax, and in later years, anything from a falling high-voltage power line to passing cars in the distance have been put forward to explain the sightings. But few explain how so many reports came in from such a vast area, many matching one another in several of their key details. All told, it had been a pretty strange weekend for the officials across the country, but it was only about to get stranger in one particular region when the unexplained sightings came to a small village near Dijon in the east of France. Poncy-sur-Lignon is a tiny scenic village tucked away on the outskirts of Dijon, full of medieval French charm. With a population of less than 100, it represents much of the French rural ideal to the tourists who pass through on their way to the nearby vineyards and wineries. On the night of Saturday the 2nd of October, just as sightings were pouring in all across France, a woman named Mrs. Gannet, the wife of the former mayor of the village, was locking up her barn for the night, having just milked her cows. It was 7:40 p.m. and the sky was already dark when she looked up to see what was described as a flying cylinder, orange in colour, surrounded by a square of pale green light, moving above a small patch of woodland in the distance. She called her husband and daughter, who joined her in the yard, and all three stood and watched the object for nearly 10 minutes before it disappeared over the horizon. Considering the events taking place all over the country, this particular sighting doesn't stand out especially, but it's the events of the nights of Monday the 4th of October, 2 days later, that give it a little more precedence. It had just gone 8 p.m. on Monday night, when a Mr. Formeray, along with several farmers, were stepping out from the mayor's house as a man on a bicycle, looking extremely excited, pedalled up towards them, yelling and out of breath. Formeray's wife, he said, had seen something in the field by their house, and she had rushed to the neighbours, sending the man out on his bicycle in the meantime to fetch her husband. The whole group rushed back to Formeray's home, where they found Mrs. Therese Formeray, along with 2 neighbours and the Formeray's young son, looking all quite taken aback. Keen to explain the situation, Therese gave an official statement to the chief of police of the nearby town of Saint-Seine. It was 8 p.m. and it had already been dark for some time. I started toward the window to close the shutters and, glancing out, I saw the thing. About 20 yards from the house, in Monsieur Cosette's meadow, a luminous body was balancing itself lightly in the air, to the right of the plum tree, as if preparing to land. As well as I was able to judge, this object was about 3 yards in diameter, and it seemed elongated, horizontal and orange-coloured. Its luminosity threw a pale light on the branches and leaves of the tree. I was beside myself with fright, and I seized the boy, running with him to Madame Boulier's house, where we closed the door tight. At this moment, Monsieur Giraudeau and Vincent arrived. Seeing how frightened we were, they wanted to know what had happened. When we told them, they armed themselves with their shotguns and ran towards the meadow. Nothing was there, but in examining the ground, they found something that proved I hadn't been dreaming. The something that Mrs. Formeray had mentioned the 2 men found was in fact a large patch of ground in the field where the object had supposedly been, where the ground was described as if it had been sucked up to a depth of around 5 centimetres. All around the mysterious scar in the ground, upturned earth had lay scattered in 12-inch clods that looked as if they'd been ripped clean from the mud and cast aside. As the group were unsuccessfully scouring the scene for anything that might have been used to excavate a large chunk of soil, a local teen, Francois Boulier, approached them at a jog, where he exclaimed that he'd been walking home from work when he had seen a luminous object of some kind leaving the area, moving up into the sky just like an aircraft, though he was quick to point out that it had had no wings. As it turned out, Francois's testimony was only the first of several that came in over the next 24 hours from members of the village who all saw a similar sight, all around the same approximate time. Initially, the police assumed there was a hoax being perpetrated by a group of villagers looking to spice up their quiet lives. However, once they reached the site for themselves, they soon changed their tune. No one could seem to explain the presence of the large hole, or how it could have been dug with such precision cuts into the soil, nor how several flowers had managed to remain in the soil, their roots completely uncut by whatever machinery had been used to rip up the turf around it. Various patches of grass were collected, and one was sent off to the University of Dijon, where it was scanned with a Geiger counter, though nothing of interest was ever noted in the results. Mrs. Formeret's official statement to the police admitted both that she hadn't gotten a good look at the light that she had seen in the field, nor had she initially thought of it as any saucer or the like, but she did describe it as more like a transparent globe lit from within. There were no bright flames or beams of light as a spotlight would produce. No sound came from the object, which at that moment must still have been about 15 metres above the ground. I couldn't say whether it was descending or ascending. At the time I was so frightened that I didn't make any assumptions. I just ran straight to my neighbour without looking back. Most described the orange light as being transparent and luminous, with a green and orange hue, glowing in the shape of a cigar and travelling at least twice as fast as a jet plane. Over the following days, the local police, alongside the French Air Force, continued their own investigations, taking statements from half a dozen witnesses before concluding the whole thing just simply a mystery. Over the next 2 weeks, dozens of sightings each day continued to be reported across the country, though by now they were beginning to lose both their details and their impact. Many were fairly easily explainable natural phenomena, whilst others were the results of a well-documented and very public flight of an atmospheric balloon that had been launched by a group of Italian scientists near the French Alps. Then, on the 16th of October, just as things appeared to be quieting down, at least in the press, a new sighting sparked more excitement. Dr. Robert Henri, a veterinary surgeon from Normandy, was driving home along a highway just outside Dieppe when his eye caught what appeared to be 4 circular objects hovering in the sky about 1,000 feet from the ground. As he watched on, the 4 objects, that seemed to be in some kind of stacked formation, broke apart, with the lowermost object zigzagging down to the ground in the road ahead of him. Slowing his car, Henri continued approaching the objects in the sky, all of which appeared to be moving rapidly closer, when all of a sudden he felt what he described as a sharp electric shock course through his body. Just then, the engine on his car died and the headlights faded to nothing, leaving his car to roll to a stop in pitch darkness. Finding himself unable to move, he watched as a faint light in the distance began to glow, silhouetting a small creature, just over 3 feet tall, which disappeared into darkness as the light faded to nothing. For several minutes, Dr. Henri stared into the night sky ahead of him, seeing nothing, until suddenly the headlights on his car lit back up, illuminating an object hovering just off the ground and moving away from the road, lifting up and over the embankment and vanishing from sight. Finding himself able to move once more, he tried the car's ignition, and with some relief, he heard the engine turn over. As soon as he arrived back in his hometown of Londinière, he notified the police of his experience, giving a full statement. Unfortunately, for Dr. Henri and other witnesses across France of the unusual airborne phenomena, the press had just about grown weary of the continuing story, and more, as news stories emerged night after night, the articles were treated with derision and scorn, and frequently were written with humour in mind. Parisian journalists, in particular, treated the stories with little more than contempt, and the term flying saucer was bandied around with full enjoyment, the whole time printed with tongue firmly in cheek. Frequently, articles would be concluded with an appended theory that witnesses were either part of a mass delusion or suffering from some kind of collective psychosis. Despite this, sightings did not seem to stop, though reports did begin to dry up in the press, and stories that were told were often days, if not weeks, after the experiences, with the witnesses openly admitting that they were afraid to tell their stories earlier due to fears of how their neighbours and their peers might react. As October continued into November, many more sightings were attributed to easily explainable natural phenomena, and slowly, over the weeks, the press began to forget. By the turn of winter, the French UFO wave of 1954 had, for all intents and purposes, petered out with a whimper, though the reports never truly stopped outright. So what exactly were people seeing in the skies of France through the late summer and autumn of 1954? All told, there were more than 2,400 reports across the year, with more than a third describing what was essentially close contact with apparent unknown beings or spacecraft, and well over 100 that had close contact with some kind of landed aircraft. The reports made it all the way to Australian newspapers and even foreign governments, with the CIA holding several archived documents of contemporary reports from several of the notable sightings. Many of the sightings can, in retrospect, be easily written off as little more than natural atmospheric phenomena, meteors and even scientific balloons, all of which have been confirmed, catalogued and largely accepted as the likely answer. There were clearly a handful of hoaxes mixed in as well, some that were eventually outed and others that remain only as likely outcomes. But still, there are many, many more cases which have no easy explanation. One interesting fact that is surely worth mentioning when speaking about UFO sightings from the early 1950s was the impact of the release of the film The War of the Worlds, adapted from the H.G. Wells novel and released across the globe to great acclaim in 1953. While certainly not the first science fiction work to reach the mainstream, the 1953 movie was released to huge acclaim and was, with almost no competition, far and away the year's most dramatic success. Whilst it seems a stretch to suggest that every witness from the French UFO wave in 1954 had all been huge fans of the movie, or that they'd all even seen or heard of the movie at all, the movie had almost certainly helped to normalise the concept that alien spacecraft were visiting Earth. Whilst the concepts of a mass delusion or collective psychosis might be outdated in psychology today, the more nuanced take that a combination of sensationalist media, both a more elastic experiencer and a more receptive audience, it does start to become easier to believe that the vast majority of sightings were little more than cases of mistaken identity, playful imagination, or wishful thinking. Is it simply too easy, though, to chalk the whole thing up to what is effectively a case of snowballing overexcitement and under-investigation? Many of the cases, if they weren't just straight hoaxes, leave us with many more questions than they do answers. The French Air Force became involved with several cases, and in a handful of them, they found actual physical evidence. Marks in the ground or damaged nearby items that were never given any specific conclusions. What if, perhaps, mixed amongst the many cases easily written off and hand-waved away, a few truly were what they seemed to be? Was the French UFO wave of 1954 all just a great big delusion, or was there something more behind the ridiculous headlines and sensational stories? So that was the story of the French UFO wave of 1954, and we absolutely will have things to say about that after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So yeah, I just want to say before I get started that I listed a couple of books in the sources. One by I think it's Amy Michelle or Amy Michelle, and it is an interesting read. But if you are interested in sort of reading a bit more into this, it's worth pointing out that it has a colossal amount of errors and misinformation. Mostly, it's the sort of core of the information is correct, but a lot of the details are wrong, like the places, the names, and the dates. So just bear that in mind. The sort of crux of the book is the experiences, and they're for the most part fine. But yeah, just bear in mind that a few of most all of the details are wrong. But it's an interesting book all the same. The other book is much more modern. I would say the Michelle book is probably the better book. But I would say if you've listened to this episode, the best thing to look into now is the website that I've sourced. Normally, to be honest, I don't really source websites with dark histories because, to be honest, I don't really use them. A lot of the time, I use websites just for like contextual sort of information, not sort of a core source. But this website that I've put in the sources is just unbelievable. It's got maybe thousands of press cutouts and police reports and any sort of official document. It just covers as many of the sightings as possible. thousands and thousands of sightings, and it's just an incredible resource. And it's translated into English from French, which is just the guy that runs it. It's a Herculean effort, and it's an incredible source. So yeah, that's say if you've listened to this episode, you've got a rough idea of what was going on, right? You've got a good overview of the French flap. If you wanted to look into it more, just probably dive into the weeds and head to that website. You can probably skip the books. I personally would. The books say there's a lot of guff in them, whereas the other stuff is sort of the core of it. That website is really the core of things, and you could just get in and you'd know what's going on, say, from the story. So yeah. Anyway, it's moving on from that. I thought it was a great story. That this French UFO flap. I grew up in the 90s, was my teenage years. So I grew up with things like the X-Files, the Outer Limits, even the Twilight Zone still was being shown. I loved all that. To me, when I was a kid, the concept of aliens visiting Earth, there was no debate. It was just a foregone conclusion. I remember back in the early days of the internet, forums like Above Top Secret, which I think is still around now, actually, but it's not what it used to be. Conspiracy theories are not what they used to be, I don't think. Like these days, conspiracy theories are all a bit political, and well, the people that are into it are not my type. But the old conspiracy theories used to be really fun. They used to be like, the government are covering up aliens, and they were all kind of these wacky kind of stories. And Above Top Secret would get really into that. I loved all that. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is I loved all that as a teenage kid. So for me, the concept of aliens was never like a debate. Say, I always just assumed that it was deadly real. As I've got older, I have to admit I've grown much more skeptical. And these days, I do sort of feel like, well, why is it that everything is just on the horizon? I do listen to some UFO podcasts and stuff like that, and I listen to them with a sort of air of caution, and it's mainly for fun. But the one sort of pattern that I always notice is there's always disclosure on the horizon. There's always another whistleblower coming out on the horizon, and then when they come out, they're never quite what they're hyped up to be, and disclosures never quite sort of managed, and all this kind of stuff. And I feel like the UFO thing, it's easy to be skeptical. You see, or even cynical, because you see a lot of the people that are perpetuating a lot of it. It's a handful of people that make a lot of money from selling their books and things like that. And I start getting a bit tired. Of course, there is so many hoax that it's hard not to sort of grow skeptical and almost cynical over time. I remember one of the earliest books I read was the Gulf Breeze incident. I got it out of the library when I was a kid, and I read it, and I was like gobsmacked by it. It was an amazing incident. If you've never looked up the Gulf Breeze incident, I might cover it on Dark Histories one day. It's probably a little bit too modern, but maybe I'll cover it on Dark Histories, because for me, it's quite a personal story. Not a personal story, but, I just remember reading it as a kid, and it has a lot of nostalgia for me, I guess. But, I later found out that it was a complete hoax, this big book that I'd read. And, as a kid, if it's in print and it's published, it must be real. You sort of take it as like dead cert, right? And then I found out later that it was all just a hoax. And so it is easy to become cynical over time. To get on topic, this story I think is really interesting. And I say, as I've grown older, I've grown a bit more skeptical. And now my interest in these kinds of stories is less about the UFOs themselves and more about the kind of the evolution of the phenomena of UFOs and UAPs, right? The phenomena of close encounters. And that's why I particularly love this story and all of these sort of experiences that I put in the episode. I love them just for their descriptions of what we saw and how that's so 1950s science fiction, and you can see the evolution almost. And so for me, that is now more my interest, I guess, is the history and the evolution of the phenomenon, where it came from. And I know, obviously, it was around beforehand. I've done episodes in for 19th century UFOs and stuff, but it really sort of burst into this mainstream in that kind of 40s and 50s period, and I just love the crossover between the science fiction of the time, the Cold War sort of paranoia and the science fiction that was coming out, and so for me, that's my interest now. I hope you enjoyed it. Whether or not you thought it was real, I don't know. I think it's an interesting one. I do think that it's more complicated than just a simple, oh, they were all hoaxes, or they were all real, or they were all meteor showers, or they were all delusion. Like, I think it's much more complicated than that. I do think that the War of the Worlds, as I mentioned, played a big part of it. I don't think by any means, as a single film, it had any sort of greater impact. But I think just as a sort of element of science fiction that propelled it into the mainstream, I think it probably did play a good part of normalizing the concept of, visitors from another world. And, that sort of thing can embolden people to speak their mind or say what they believe they saw, or, these sorts of stories. And I also think it not only emboldens people, but it has the ability to allow people to start questioning what they're seeing. So before, they might have seen the meteor shower and just gone, well, that's a bit weird, but chalk it up to a natural thing. And then, they might like later then sort of find out about the meteor shower. But as we get these stories of, science fiction coming out, and we're getting more and more stories every night of people seeing things in the sky, people are more willing to accept that what they might have seen might not be meteors, or it might be something unexplainable. Maybe they can be part of this thing. There's a big draw to that. There's almost like, people find it easier to say something that they think is slightly wacky when other people are saying the same thing, right? It's much easier for them to get on board with those sorts of things. And so I do think, whilst you can't chalk it up to any one thing, I think this whole UFO wave of 1954 really is a sort of amalgamation of many things. I think we had like sensationalism in the press that were just doing it to make a bit of money. They were just doing it because it sold papers. We had like the prevalence of science fiction at the time. We have like a sort of emboldened audience that are almost self-propelling the whole thing forward, like a snowball kind of thing. And you get that kind of snowball effect. I think all of these things, like you could call it like a mass hallucination or a mass delusion, but I think that almost dumbs it down and makes it's a bit too crass of a concept. I think it's much more nuanced and subtle than that, and I think it's much more multifaceted as well. But yeah, do I think any of it was real? I suppose that's the crux of the question, right? I don't know. I think lots of things were natural phenomena. I think there was a lot of meteor showers going on, and I think a lot of people maybe mistook that. The ones with the aliens, now come on, they're the really good ones, right? They're the ones we care about. The ones with the small divers. I don't believe those. And my reasoning for this is not because I'm like a great skeptic or anything. It's just the way they're described, right? Back in the 50s, if you look at sort of science fiction around about that sort of time, often the aliens were frequently described as having like very man-made objects, like divers outfits. And it could be that these people are just trying to describe something that they think is similar, that they've got something that they can understand that they think is similar. So they say divers. It might not have been a diver's costume, but generally speaking, a lot of science fiction use those kind of man-made visuals in their drawings of aliens and stuff. And I feel like a lot of these sort of close encounters from this episode were really just descriptions of things they'd read in science fiction, unfortunately. Some of the others are a little bit more interesting. I think some of the craft descriptions were quite interesting. I think the one in the farmhouse where it landed on the railway sleepers and made indentations, that's quite interesting. That said, I can think of things that dent railway sleepers quite easily. Just rocks getting run over by the train can easily dent a railway sleeper. I mean, that's why they're made of thick, heavy wood, is because they're beaten and battered. So, but it's an interesting theory. The most terrifying one for me was the last one, the guy in his car, the vet, Dr. Henri, driving along and being paralyzed in your car and having the car just shut down and you just plunged into darkness. In the distance, you see this kind of silhouetted like being. That was, to me, the most terrifying one. But do I believe them? I don't think I do, unfortunately. I think, generally speaking, it was atmospheric kind of phenomena mixed with a bit of hoax and a bit of kind of imagination, and then perhaps mixed with one or two kind of genuine sightings of things that couldn't be explained. The one of the more interesting ones, I think, is the very first one, actually, in January the 4th at the airbase. That one to me is something that I can get a bit more on board with and say, okay, that was genuinely unexplainable. That seems weird that no one saw this plane or whatever it was take off after it had landed. That one seems interesting. There was debris the next day, but it was gone and no one ever knew where it went, and there was no explanation ever given. So ones like that, I think that sort of filter through it, the whole experience, the whole year. I think one or two are quite interesting and do present like a genuinely unexplainable situation. I think most of them, though, are probably victim of the whole snowballing affair. But, it doesn't stop it being an interesting story. It doesn't stop it stirring my sort of imagination and excitement. I read these things, and even though I'm skeptical, I still think, I still believe that there must be aliens, and they perhaps they're visiting, despite all the evidence that suggests they're not. But anyway, I'll leave that there. I hope you enjoyed the episode. So it was a little bit quirky this time, a little bit different. I hope you enjoyed it. Just another quick shout out. If you did want to do the Christmas campfire, feel free to get in touch sometime before, say, about the 20th of December. It would be great. Otherwise, if you'd like to contact me for any other reason, all the contact information is in the show notes, as well as the email, which is contact@darkhistories.com. There's the website, darkhistories.com. You'll find links to all of that, as well as ways that you can support the show, which would be greatly received. Any support you can muster would be brilliant. I'm just one guy doing this in my home, and it can be quite overwhelming at times, but it's always good fun. So don't worry about it. No stress. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. So until then, take care.